This will be the final part in our cell series. We'll focus on the nucleus in this lesson. But first, a quick recap. In part 1, we looked at the structure and function of the cell membrane. It's a selectively permeable barrier, permeable because of specialized proteins that allow certain important molecules in and other molecules out. In part 2, we examined what happens to the food molecules, and this is part of the chemistry of life. We have proteins that will be interacting with food molecules to break it down to release energy. So we want to think of food molecules as storing potential energy that gets released when this metabolism occurs. The glucose molecule will be broken down a little bit, and then those molecules enter the mitochondria, and that was the focus of part 3, the role of the mitochondria. Its job is to produce lots of chemical energy for the cell. So there's complex chemistry going on here. Again, teams of proteins are responsible. The chemistry requires oxygen. CO2 is liberated as waste. But that chemical energy is in the form of ATP molecules, which store usable quantities of chemical energy. And the cell uses that chemical energy to do molecular construction projects. So here we have a protein here whose job is to link two molecules together. Now, the nutrients that we eat as food are some of the basic building blocks for this molecular construction. We have amino acids in our diet, so those are the building blocks of proteins. And when we eat anything, like a hamburger or a salad, the cells have DNA, so we're getting building blocks of DNA, and there are fats in our diet. These are the building blocks for molecular construction. So in this lesson, we'll focus on the role of the nucleus and what's its job. Now here we see a bunch of human cheek cells, and again we have one cell here, the cell membrane, and the darkly stained object would be the nucleus. It is a membrane-bound structure, so we're looking at the dark stain is the stain of the nuclear membrane. Let's take a look at a cartoon version of that. So here's a drawing that shows a cutaway of the nuclear membrane, and we notice that there are some holes in the membrane. So there are these pores. Those pores are important because they allow important molecules into and out of the nucleus. Now we'll say at this point that not all cells have a nuclear membrane. However, within the nucleus are very important molecules that all cells do have. And that molecule is DNA, shown here. Here's our double helix of DNA. Now, in cells with a nucleus, the DNA exists as more complicated molecules called chromosomes. So a chromosome is a long molecule of DNA that is wrapped up around proteins and then coiled and supercoiled, and that's what a chromosome is. Now, not all cells have a nuclear membrane, but all cells have DNA. DNA is important because DNA is the hereditary molecule for life on Earth. This means that it contains the information to make an organism, and it can be duplicated so that organisms can reproduce. Remember, living things must be able to reproduce. To reproduce, there must be some kind of information for how to build the cell's parts, and that's going to be stored in DNA. Specifically, DNA stores the recipes for making proteins. Now that should not surprise you at this point, because we've learned that proteins are doing all the really important kinds of things to keep a cell alive. They're transporting food into the cell across the membrane. They're breaking down food molecules. They're building important molecules like proteins and DNA, lipids and such. So it's not surprising then at this point that DNA is storing the recipes to build proteins. Importantly then, DNA can be duplicated with the help of proteins, yet another important function for proteins. And here we see this would be a single-celled organism like an amoeba, and we've got DNA in the nucleus. Well, that DNA stores information to make proteins, but critically, for the purpose of reproduction, the DNA can be duplicated. And then the cell will divide into two cells, each cell getting a copy of the DNA so that the daughter cells have all the recipes to build all the proteins they need. Now, it so happens, and we'll learn more about this later in the course, that when DNA gets duplicated, there can be changes to the DNA. And these changes are called mutations, and this creates variations in the offspring. And that is going to be how we're going to understand how species can change over time. Because the reproduction process is not precise. There are errors introduced into the genetic material, and so we get variation. And this is where Darwin's going to come in and say, well, if there's variation in offspring, it means some individuals might have a better a chance of survival and reproducing, so those individuals will get to be parents and pass on their traits, and that's what he called natural selection. So DNA, a critically important molecule in the cell. In this slide, then, we have the completion of our picture of the cell, and now we've added the nucleus, inside of which is DNA. DNA stores the recipes to build the proteins. So all of these proteins, the channel proteins, the proteins that start attacking the food molecules, there's a whole bunch of proteins in mitochondria. There are proteins in the cytoplasm that are building things. All the proteins in the cell, each of them has a recipe stored in DNA. And when the cell reproduces, it will have to copy its DNA so that the two daughter cells have the recipes needed to build those all-important proteins. All right, it's time to summarize then what we've learned. Let's take a look at some of the universal features of cells. All cells have a boundary that controls the entry of nutrients and the exit of wastes. All cells have a fluid interior where the chemistry of life occurs. All cells extract energy and resources from the environment to maintain life. In addition, all cells have a team of molecular machines called proteins that do a wide variety of tasks needed to keep the cell alive. And that includes processing energy from food, building the cell's molecular parts, repairing damage, carrying out cell reproduction. And all cells have a set of information molecules called DNA that carry the instructions for making the proteins, those molecular machines. And importantly, DNA can be duplicated so that cells can reproduce. Now, we mentioned earlier, a nucleus is not a universal feature of a cell. Bacteria cells do not have a nuclear membrane surrounding their DNA. Neither do bacteria have mitochondria, as bacteria are the same size as mitochondria. So mitochondria wouldn't be able to fit inside a bacteria cell. There are many types of bacteria, and they inhabit every corner of the planet. Here we see two different kinds of bacteria. So this little rod-like thing is a bacteria cell under 1,000 magnification. Now, to give you a sense of how small they are, let's take a look at this slide. In this picture, we see a section of an amoeba here. It's called a pseudopod, an extension of the amoeba's membrane here. We see one of the amoeba's favorite prey, Paramecia, over here. These are two single-celled organisms, but remember, they were complex cells. So these two types of cells have a nucleus and they have mitochondria. All these little things that you see all over the picture here, those are bacteria cells. Now, they're gathered together in little clumps, but you can see the size difference. So let's see if I can pick out. Here's one little bacteria right there. So one bacteria cell is very, very small compared to some of these larger complex cells. Bacteria have DNA, but it's a circular piece of DNA. It's not a long kind of linear molecule that we would call a chromosome. So it's a circular piece of DNA, but again, there's no nuclear membrane surrounding it. Now, if we think about then cell universals, bacteria have a cell membrane. Bacteria, well, actually many of them also have a cell wall, but they do have a cell membrane. All cells have a cell membrane. Bacteria have cytoplasm that fills the interior where proteins perform the chemistry of life. Bacteria have DNA, which stores the information to make the cells protein. So we can sort of use a simplified sort of bacteria type of cell to illustrate what all cells have. Cells are like modern cars. They have a boundary, which is the membrane. They have an engine, and that's the metabolism that we talked about, the proteins that are breaking apart food molecules, and now bacteria don't have mitochondria, so they're not doing that chemistry, but they are doing metabolism on food. So we're going to call that the metabolic engine, even though they don't have mitochondria. And all cells have a computer, and we're going to call that the DNA. And the DNA is the recipe to build those proteins, and it regulates, in a sense, the operation of all those proteins that are doing their jobs in the cell. So to wrap up this lesson series, we'll revisit some of those questions that we began the series with. What is going on in cells? Well, we'll say that a whole bunch of different kinds of molecules are interacting in very important ways that allows the cell to meet all of the demands of life. How do cells manage to have all of the characteristics on the list? That list that makes something alive. Let's just take two of them, say metabolism. Well, metabolism referred to all that complex chemistry, the chemistry of life, that was performed by teams of different kinds of proteins. These proteins are specialized. They're like molecular adaptations, specialized to perform a certain kind of chemical reaction. So those proteins can extract energy from food or build cell parts, etc. What about reproduction? Reproduction is possible because cells have DNA. DNA is the recipe to build the proteins, but critically it can be duplicated, so daughter cells have the genetic information to build cell parts. Why are cells so small? We learned that cells face an energy shortage if they get too big. So as cells grow, their surface area does grow so they can import more food, but their volume grows faster than their surface area, and their energy needs are related to volume. So cells face an energy shortage when they get too big. This is why cells must reproduce and remain small. Are there common features to cells? We just reviewed that, and we're going to end this series then with this question: how can a living thing be composed of non-living parts? Well, this in a sense is the sort of puzzle, one of the puzzles of life. In this picture we see a human here. She is alive and she is composed of cells. Now what we're going to say is that cells are the fundamental units of life, and it's in virtue of the fact that she's made of cells that she is alive. So we're going to say that animals and plants are alive because they're made of living units, the fundamental units of life, which are cells. But critically, the parts inside cells, all those molecules, the proteins and the lipids and the chromosomes and DNA and even mitochondria, are not alive. So we will end our series with just some interesting things to think about, that cells are made of molecules which are not alive. A living thing, therefore, is composed of non-living parts. And this means the interaction of non-living molecules creates a living cell. So life is a process. That's how a living thing can be constructed of non-living parts, because life is not just a static collection of objects, it's a process of important molecules like proteins and food molecules interacting in space and time. And that complex chemistry is a process. So while the molecules that cells are composed of are not alive, when they interact in space and time, and they've been shaped by evolutionary forces like natural selection so that proteins have unique jobs to do. When all of the proteins are doing their proper jobs, the whole assembly that we call a cell is alive.